So now we're going to move on, and I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, which is Professor Bentley Allan. So Professor Allan is an assistant professor of political science. His research focuses on the history and theory of international order, global environmental politics, the role of science and expertise in global politics, and qualitative methods. And so he's going to talk to us today about the global politics of decarbonization. All right, so thanks, Bentley, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you everybody for being here. There we go. That look okay? Okay, so I'm going to talk about the global politics of decarbonization. I'm going to try to, again, as Susanna just said, I sort of spend most of my time theorizing at the level of international order or world order, but I've also been doing some climate policy work over the last couple of years, and this talk is kind of an attempt to integrate those two. So let's just see if I can get off the ground here. So the problem, as I pose it for the purposes of this talk, is how can we catalyze a global energy transition? And it really gets back to that first question in the Q&A from the previous talk, where the question was like, what role will technology play? I mean, at the same time, I'm a political scientist, so we have to talk about how technology and politics can really be integrated here. So for the last 30 years or so, we've tried a strategy, which I'll sort of label here as competitive globalization plus a global carbon price. And the idea was that we would have a bunch of firms producing technology from different countries all over the world. They would compete with one another. That would drive down costs, that would produce good technology, just like competitive capitalism always does. And then we would create a global carbon price, and that would force everybody to transition smoothly from fossil fuels onto these new technologies. And the price would deliver an efficient mechanism in order to discipline everybody into that new technological regime. And this would all be done more or less within the rules of what we would call the liberal international order. That is an order premised upon the free exchange of goods, open borders for capital, which is to say like finance and investment, but also open borders for trade in goods and services. We tried this for 30 years, as I said, starting in 1990. And by 2015, it was clear that this plan was not going to work. And the Paris Agreement is really a placeholder for whatever is coming next. And there's not a lot of content to the Paris Agreement. We could talk about this in the Q&A if you want. But really, the way I'm characterizing it here is it's just a placeholder for whatever comes next. So what does come next? I'm going to argue today that the next strategy that we have for catalyzing a global energy transition that will, end global warming in time, is what I call a global green industrial policy, okay? And under a global green industrial policy, a bunch of different countries are going to help their private sectors develop new technologies. And there's also going to be a competitive dynamic, but it's not going to happen under the old rules of the liberal international order. And that's what's going to make everything kind of messy. The thing is, we don't really know what a global green industrial policy is going to look like. It's sort of a weird time to be in my field where something is dead, which is the liberal international Western American hegemonic order. That's dead, and we do not know what is coming. And the coronavirus and all of the deficits of American leadership have only accelerated this transition. But for the last 2 or 3 years in my field, we can kind of feel this sense that we're at the birth of something new. We just don't know exactly what it is that's going to be born. So I'm going to try to characterize what I think needs to be born in the case of the global energy transition, but also it's really a new way of stating what's coming next in international order. So what is a green industrial policy? First, I'll just define it really quickly here, which is that it's a set of targeted measures to bolster the development of a specific industry for some environmental end, some environmental goal. So it's a targeted policy that a government implements in order to boost a specific industry. In this case, we might say, for the purposes of this talk, we'll just think about clean energy as being that industry, okay? And these supports could include subsidies, feed-in tariffs, which have been used to encourage solar and wind installation. It can include infrastructure investment, like spending on a smart grid or a slightly smarter grid, maybe. But it could also include taxes on various things, like a carbon tax or whatever. And the key is that they're kind of sectorally specific, that they are targeted in a specific way to foster a certain kind of industry. So what's an example of this? The European Commission lately has been doing some really interesting stuff. One of the things that they've put together in the last 3 years is called the European Battery Alliance. And basically what they saw was that China and Japan dominated the world market share for the construction of batteries. Even Tesla, which has a huge battery factory in the West, it basically relied on Panasonic for its expertise. And so it's really a Tesla / Panasonic battery factory. But Europe wanted to build a European battery industry. So they got together and they built what was called a public-private partnership, where firms and researchers get together with government officials and they work out what the plan is going to be, what the strategy is going to be. Instead of leaving the free market to operate, government officials really get involved in terms of catalyzing what kind of technology needs to be developed. And the backing for it is a strategic reason. In Europe, it is the case that car manufacturing is a huge part of the European economy. And 40% of the cost of an electric vehicle is the battery. And so they're looking to Asia and they say Asia is controlling 40% of the cost chain for vehicle manufacturing. That means 40% of our most important industry, strategically speaking, is controlled by people who don't have, who aren't in Europe. And this caused some concern, and the response was to develop a strategic European battery industry. So it's cross-sectoral. It goes across from government into the private sector, into civil society, including bringing the unions as well as environmental organizations on board to help push and organize the strategy across Europe as a whole. The main impetus that the state is giving the battery manufacturers in Europe is a set of state-backed loans. So the Europeans have a large infrastructure bank and investment bank, and they're using money from that to back private corporations to build large factories. We do that. Tesla benefited from a government-backed loan back in just after the original financial crisis. That was part of Obama's lost green stimulus. So lots of people do this, but we're really increasing the amount of support that we're starting to see, and it's largely a response to China doing this a lot. So it has a real nationalist edge to it, and this is true especially in Europe, but also is increasingly true in the United States, which is to say that the reason why Europe feels like it needs to have a battery chain is because they do not trust dependency on China as part of their overall global economic vision. So here's a great quote from an article in the FT. The French finance minister says, "I really think of this as an issue of sovereignty, that is, of independence, of autonomy." And that sovereignty is a geopolitical word. It's a word about how states maintain power in the international system. And what they're saying is that if we lose control of the auto industry, we're no longer independent in the international system. We can no longer hold our own weight, and we're basically subservient to other countries. And so you can see here that their plan is to go from controlling about 3% of batteries today all the way up to almost 30% of global market share by 2030. Sorry, this is the Europe band in here. They'll control about 15 or something like that. Okay, now if sovereignty is at the heart of this, if a nationalism is at the heart of this, does this mean the end of the liberal international order? Does this mean the end of an international order premised upon global capitalism? I'm going to suggest in just a couple of minutes that it doesn't necessarily have to do that, but this is a little bit of a pipe dream. I mean, global cooperation has not really been going so well in the case of coronavirus, and there's little reason to think that anything I'm about to propose for the next 3 minutes is going to work, but I'll do it anyway. The first is that we need a system for what I call targeted global innovation. And what this would mean, practically speaking, is a science policy institute that would run parallel to the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC was trying to create a global carbon price from Kyoto through to Copenhagen, and the failures of all of those global diplomatic efforts I think are still with us, but they need to try to do something different. So I've got this proposal here for thinking about global technology development as being a cooperative endeavor. Instead of just leaving it to individual firms happening within Europe or within China or within the US, what we need is for US firms, European firms, and Asian firms to sit down, work on what are the issues here from basic research all the way up through the diffusion of the technology, and to think about how current existing efforts, this is the horizon scanning, might be linked together into an overall value chain for producing clean technology and renewables. At the same time, we can't think purely technologically. We have to think about how technology is embedded in larger political problems. So there has to be a second component of this, which is really rethinking the principles underneath the global economy from a purely liberal and market-based order to whatever it is that's going to come next. And I'll just take a quick stab at trying to characterize that. First, we need state-led capitalism. But what does that mean practically? It doesn't mean getting rid of capitalism. And it doesn't quite mean social democracy a la, the Northern European states, partly because China won't go along with something that's called social democracy. And China needs to be part of whatever kind of new arrangement for the global economy we come up with. So I would rather talk in terms of limited but competitive markets. These markets need to be limited and socially circumscribed by values, goals, and interests. But at the same time, states need to be able to compete with each other through these markets. But at the same time, there are, as we're learning in the coronavirus epidemic, technologies that we don't want to have globalized, that everybody wants to have access to themselves. Maybe not every region of the world can have its own car manufacturing, but probably they all need to have their own for PPE and for those kind of medical technologies if pandemics are going to become a part of it. But in clean tech, we can also think about analogous technologies. There will be some technologies in clean tech that everybody can share, and there will be some that are considered vital to national interest that need to have closed value chains within regions or within countries or within alliances. So we need small yards, a select number of technologies, but high fences, that is lots of defense to keep and support a regional or national industry. There's also a need for redoing how we do capital, but that's a whole different conversation, how we do finance in the world. And so I think that we need a different model for how we're going to manage competitive interdependence in this model. And I'm doing a bunch of work with historians and political scientists and clean tech people to kind of characterize what these ground rules should be for the global economy. And we're just at the start of our work, but I think it's something that is really important. So just to sum up, we need a global green industrial policy. And that's really going to be comprised of two things: targeted innovation and some new economic principles. So thank you very much for letting me go on like that. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Bentley. Okay, a lot to think about there. So please enter your questions into the Q&A box. And I guess I'll get this started. So you talk about this need for new global policy, economic policy surrounding clean tech and other things. And so my question would be, what kind of entities do you see leading this policy discussion internationally? Is this something that, you talked about some failures of the UN, we've seen some failures of the, the World Health Organization. What about an entity like the G8, or what are you sort of thinking as a mechanism to implement these things?
Well, I think it should still be parallel to the UN FCC process, the major climate negotiation process. But it definitely needs to start by taking existing industry groups. So there's an international aviation industry group where all of the major airlines are participants in this large organization. So you need to take those pre-existing public-private partnerships and bring them into the room with climate negotiators, as well as people who are thinking strategically about the economic interests of particular countries, create that cross-sectoral, but at the same time very specific meeting and convening and organize around those pre-existing groups. So what I would be proposing would be something like a global public-private partnership that would sit alongside the UNFCCC, and that would be linked to the efforts of the UNFCCC. Because the main problem under the Paris Agreement is no one knows how this stuff's going to get implemented. But so you need to provide a strategic and economically viable pathway for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, but you need to bring in the private sector in order to do that. I think, in order to do it fast anyway. Like if we feel like we have some time and we want to roll some dice with the climate, we could take a less modernist or less capitalistly driven strategy. But if we want to do it fast, this is the only way to do it.
Okay, that makes sense. So I do have one more audience question for you before transitioning. So, so the question is that considering the strength of industrial lobbies and regulatory capture, there's perhaps little faith that state-led industrial policy will be for the public good. Rather, it may choke off innovation and newcomer industries. So the question is, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I mean, I think that has been the argument that has restrained these kinds of efforts for a long time. And I just think that we have to figure out how to get through that. And then there are lots of insights from political science about how we could break regulatory capture and how we can avoid that. I think in Europe, for example, at the end of the day, these firms need to be able to deliver real value to the market. So the firm that won the first round of negotiation under the European Battery Alliance was Nordpool. They didn't exist 3 years ago. They were created for this venture. They came out of this venture because they had particular engineers with a particular value added, and they convinced the EIB that they had the best plan for building the largest factory. And so it wasn't a pre-existing industry. In fact, the largest battery manufacturer in Europe, in France, you know, they are in the second round, maybe. But they were not necessarily favored in it. So I definitely think that Europe has figured out ways in order to get around the regulatory capture problem. And we can't let the necessary and important objection that this could be a problem get in the way of starting to move forward with strategic vision on these issues.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much again. So there are more questions for you in the Q&A window, so I'll ask if you can to just answer them in that window itself, because I think we should move on to the next speaker.
Thank you, everybody.
So thank you, Bentley. Thanks. All right, and so now I will